Ready to get started with your PROVerXL 4030? Then stick around because that's what we'll be going through in this episode. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of James Dean Designs. Now in today's episode we're going to be getting started with the PROVerXL 4030. Hopefully at this point you've already built yours, but if you haven't, check out the link in the corner to the previous episode where we get all of this assembled. Now today what we're going to do is a few basic checks on the machine itself to make sure everything is ready to run. We're then going to move over to the PC, get everything installed and connected, and finally finish by making our first test cut. Now all of the files that I use in the video today will be available in the description area below. You can also find other useful links there, such as to the Patreon page where you can support the channel, or any products that are featured in today's video will also be able to be found in that description area, so do check it out. Now let's move over to the machine, take a closer look and start to do some of those initial checks. So these checks should be carried out regularly anyway, and the first one sounds obvious, but we want to make sure everything has been tightened and that only the parts that should move actually move. Now the next thing we want to take a look at is the thread rods on each of the axes. The Y actually has two of them. We need to make sure these are kept clean and that they are lubricated correctly to allow everything to move freely with minimal friction. Now there's a certain type of lubricant we need to use on this. It's called a PTFE dry lubricant. Grease is not the right type of lubricant to use on these. As I say, it should be a dry lubricant because that stops dust sticking to it. Now lots of manufacturers make dry lubricant. The two that I use, one is by Muc-Off, one is by Putaline. There's also another popular one by WD-40, and again links to all these products can be found in the description below. The next thing that we need to check is the actual gantry itself. We need this to be parallel to the front and the back, otherwise when you're cutting it will cut at a slight angle, and I'll show you how to set this now. So as I say, the purpose of this is to make sure that the gantry is parallel to the front and back, because if it's at an angle and it's not cutting square, it will affect your end results. Now you can either take a tape measure, measure both sides, and then adjust one or the other accordingly to make sure that they're the same. An easier method for me, I find taking a solid item like a piece of wood, placing that in, adjusting one until it just about touches the wood, and then move that over to the other side and do exactly the same. And that way we know that they're both equal and everything is now parallel. So with all our initial checks done, let's get a piece of material held down on the bed, a tool into the collet ahead of moving over to the PC. Now I always fix the material first, because if you have a tool in there and you're moving your hands about, you can run the risk of injuring yourself. Now we can use the clamps that came with the machine. These go into the threaded inserts as shown in the setup video and obviously hold the material in place. One concern I have though is as the Z axis comes down and moves about, you can run the risk of hitting these clamps. So what I'm going to do, which I've featured in other episodes, is use blue tape and CA glue. If you're not familiar with this, what we do is apply a couple of layers of blue tape, then use the CA glue and the activator to hold everything down. The glue I'm going to be using today is from Starbond. It's really good glue. I'm extremely happy with it, and they've actually given me a 5% discount code to share with everyone. It's in the description below this video. I'll run through a quick setup of how to use the tape and the glue now. Obviously, if you're already familiar with this, feel free to skip ahead in the video a little bit. Apply a couple of pieces of tape to the material. Also then apply a couple of pieces of tape to the base as well. We then take the glue and apply a layer to the base. Just scribble some on. We then take the activator and spray this onto the material. And place them on top of each other. And within a few seconds they should be dry. Hold that down. We give it a couple of seconds to set. And there we have it. That's held firmly in position. Now because it's on the blue tape, we can just peel that off later and it comes off nice and clean. Next we're going to put a tool into the collet itself. I'll be using the 20-degree V-bits that come with the machine. Be very careful, these are sharp and will cut you. You need to make sure the collet is slack using the spanners provided with the machine, and then this should slide up inside the collet and tighten it up a little bit by hand. Once it's holding the bit, use the spanners provided to tighten it up and make sure it's held well. I always leave the caps on until I'm ready to cut, just to avoid injuring myself. So before moving over to the computer, we'll just do a few things on the control box. Starting on the left hand side, make sure your power cable is connected, but do not turn the power on at this stage. There is also a switch on the other side for controlling between 110 and 220 volts depending on what country you're in. You'll need to release the emergency stop button, and to do this, rotate it and it springs back into the open position. For safety, turn the speed down to about halfway. Now over here there is another switch for going between the laser or the spindle. We'll want to make sure this is pushed to the right in order to use the spindle. And last, connect your USB lead, but do not connect it to the computer at this point. So now we move over to the PC. You'll want to make sure you have the USB stick to hand that came with your machine. If you don't have that USB stick, head over to Google. You can type in Sainsmart resources and you'll see that the Genmitsu PROVerXL 4030 comes up. If you click into there, it will give us the option to download everything that was available on the USB stick. So what we'll do now is head over to the USB stick, and the first thing we want to open up is the driver. So at this point I would suggest plugging in the USB cable to your PC or laptop. I've seen that some people have had issues not being able to install the driver without the USB cable being plugged in. So we'll open up the driver and we'll click yes, and then we will click install. It should take a second and then give us a completed message at the end. There we are, install successful. Now we'll close that down. What we want to do at this point is just check that everything is installed and we know what COM port the USB is connected to. You can either right click on this PC or my computer if you're using an older version and come to manage. Alternatively, you can come to the start menu and type device manager and it will also show up. Now in here we go to device manager, and this just lists things that are attached or connected to your computer, and we'll come down to ports, and now we can see USB serial CH340, which is the driver we've just installed, and that's assigned to COM5. We need to make a note of that when we open Candle shortly. So we'll close that down now and we'll come back to the top folder on the USB stick. Now you can run Candle from the USB stick. I would highly suggest copying this folder over to somewhere more suitable, such as one of your hard drives. For the ease of this tutorial, I have copied it over to the desktop. So I'm just going to minimize this and open my version on the desktop. And what we'll want to do is open the GRBL control, which is Candle. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that Candle is connected to the machine. Now you don't necessarily need the power turned onto the machine at this point. There is enough from the USB port to do this. However, if you are having issues, it may benefit to turn the machine on at this point. To connect the machine, we'll go up to service and we'll come to settings. Now we just made a note that this is COM5 that I need, so I'll click the drop down box and click COM5. If for any reason you're not seeing the COM port that we just went through, click the refresh button and it should load it. The other thing you need to check is the baud rate is 115200. There are a lot of other options in here that you can adjust, such as the units and increments that it works in, but for now that is the only settings that are relevant just to get it to connect. We'll click OK. Now straight away we can see the alarm has signalled. This is a safety feature and I'll tell you how to unlock this shortly. And we can also see that down here that it is connected. Just to be safe, what you can do to check that it is connected is click into this box here, type $, hit enter, and it will load up all your GRBL settings. If you're not familiar with GRBL, this is where you can change settings to tune your machine, such as the speeds that it runs at. I've linked up in the corner to the GRBL tuning video that I've previously done on the 3018 Pro for ease. Fortunately, the 4030 should be ready to run straight out of the box, so hopefully you won't need to adjust any of these settings. So we'll quickly run through the layout in Candle first. This top area up here is the visualizer. When we load a job in shortly, it will show us everything that is expected to happen with the machine and the path that it will follow. It gives us a good indication of what the job is that we're going to be carrying out. Down here will be the list of commands that Candle will be sending over to the machine. And over here we have our controls area where we can operate the machine. So I'll quickly talk through some of the buttons. Our machine has limit switches, so we can use the home feature. We're not going to do it in this video, but I will talk about it more in another episode. Same with the Z probe. Again, it's a really useful feature for when you're trying to set the exact height of your material, and again we will cover that in a separate episode. The next two are to zero the X and Y and the Z axis. Now this is useful for basically what you're telling Candle to do is where you want the job to start for all three axes. The next two buttons are to reset the machine. This is a bit like a soft reset rather than turning it on and off. The next one is also the unlock feature. Now I just mentioned the alarm up here. This is the way we disable the alarm, is we click unlock and it allows the machine to start running. Next we have the spindle control area. Now the speed control on the spindle itself is manual, so we don't need to use this slider. However, the button over here on the right is to turn the spindle on and off, and this can be a useful feature when you're testing the machine. We'll come back to this shortly. Next we have the jog control area. Now this is fairly self-explanatory, but as you hover over each button it will give you a little note to say what each axis does. Obviously forward, back, left and right on the X and the Y axis. The two over here are for the Z axis. You have Z up and Z down. Next we have the step. This is basically the distance we're telling the machine to move each time. So it's currently set to 100 mil. If I clicked on right it would travel 100 mil to the right. Next we have the feed rate, and this is the speed at which it is telling that to move. So if I clicked right it would tell it to move 100 millimeters at a speed of 2000 millimeters per minute. So basically the higher this number is, the faster it will move. The lower it is, the slower it will move. We briefly covered the console area, but this is where we can see a live preview of the code being sent to the machine, and again also edit some of the settings. So at this point let's turn the power onto the machine and just do a few basic checks of jogging the head about and making sure everything works. You will hear the fan kicking in the background. So what we're going to simply tell the machine to do is move forward and back by 100 mil. So if we do that now, we'll do the same to go left and right. Now do be careful with the Z axis. Whenever you're using this, I prefer to use it in smaller increments, just because 100 can be, or even bigger, can be quite dangerous when using the Z axis. So we'll bring that down to 10 and just test out the Z axis. Now as I mentioned earlier, this is a button to turn the spindle on and off. We don't need to use the speed control, but we can turn it and just check that it's working as expected. Excellent. So at this point we know the machine is working as we want it to. Now for any reason when you press these buttons the machine goes in a different direction than what you were expecting, the setting you will need to adjust is the $3, and that is this one here. It currently says 0, and you may need to change the 0 to another number in order to invert whichever axis is not working. So with everything working, let's go ahead and load in a file so we can do our first test cut. We go up to File and Open. Now on the USB stick that came with the machine there is a test G-code folder with a PROVerXL logo in there to use. Now I found a slight glitch in the G-code for this, so I'm not going to use this file. Instead I've created one for my own logo. Again, this will be available to download from the link in the description area. So we'll click Open. And what we can see in the visualizer is what we're expecting to be cut. You can see the solid lines are the paths that the tool is going to take, and the dotted line is the travel between those different shapes. Now the joys of the visualizer is this is all 3D, so if you click you can move this all about and you'll start to see what we're expecting from the machine. Now the origin point over here is where we're expecting the job to start. This will be our 0 point that we will set shortly. And basically what will happen is it will come up and it will follow one of the dotted lines to the first shape, come back down, cut that out, move along and work its way through everything before coming back to the start point. So it's a really useful tool when tracking your job because you can see exactly what you're expecting. Now there are some buttons up here to be able to rotate the view of this. This is quite a flat design so it's quite easy to see, but if you've got a more 3D design these different view perspectives can help. I'll just revert to the original. What's also useful on the visualizer is down here in the bottom left hand corner we have the sizes that are expected to come out at, and this is X, Y and then Z. So the X, which is from the left to the right, is expected to be 107mm. The Y, which is from the bottom to the top, is 25.7mm, and then the Z, if I rotate this, is 10.8mm. So from there it will travel up 10.8, and that's the highest point it will be. Now as we've loaded this in, we can also see a list of commands that have loaded here in this area, and these are just the lines of code that will be sent across to the machine. You don't need to know what all these mean, but obviously as time goes on it is useful to start to learn what the different pieces mean, because you can help solve problems later on. So the next thing we need to do is set the 0 point, or the start point for the job. And what we'll do is jog the machine over to the bottom left of the material in order to tell it to start to cut the job in that area. So what I'm going to do first is set this to 100mm. Actually, so I'm going to set this to 50mm, and we'll navigate this over to the bottom of the material. Just to make it easy, I'm going to lower the Z. I think there's more than 50mm travel, so that should be safe. And we'll get this a little bit closer. Obviously the closer you get to the corner or your starting point, I usually lower the increments again for safety. Now it doesn't need to be exact, but what I am going to do is take the cover off the tool at this point to set the 0 correctly. We just lower the Z down until it's quite close to touching the material. I'm going to bring this down to 1mm increments. Now basically what you want is the tip of the tool to be touching just the top of the surface. When we use a Z probe in another episode this will become easier, but for the purpose of this we can just do it by eye. Going to bring that up by a little bit, about 1/2mm. It's now perfectly touching the top of the material. So it's not quite on the corner of the MDF, but for the purpose of this it's close enough. Now what we need to do is tell it that this is our start point, or the 0 point. So we'll come up to these options here and we'll click 0xy and also 0z, and now it knows that that is the start point, and we can see up here all the work coordinates have gone to 0, 0, 0, which is exactly what we want. So with all that done, we are ready to get our first test cut underway, and now we've set the 0, you can also see this is a representation of the spindle itself over here on the left, and as the job runs this will go in live time across all the different paths. Now the final thing we are going to do is just turn the power up on the control box, or the speed, and we're going to turn that not quite to full but close enough. And so with everything done, let's get our first job underway. We'll come down and click the send button and it should start the job. And we have a message telling us that our job has been completed in 1 minute 43 seconds. And as I said earlier, we can then lift this off. Takes a little bit of pressure, but obviously that means it's held down well. No marks on the board, this just peels off. And that's our first job done. And at the end of that we have our first test cut done on the PROVerXL 4030. I can genuinely say this machine has just worked out of the box. I haven't had to adjust any settings to get it running. I'm really happy about that. I hope yours goes as smooth as well. If you do hit issues, as always, comment down below and I will work through your problems with you to find a solution. Now, we will be covering things like the Z probe and the homing sequences on other episodes, but I didn't want to cram too much into this first setup video because it can be a bit to take in. Now, before I wrap the episode up, I just want to say a big thank you to my supporters on PayPal and Patreon. It really does mean a lot to me and helps keep this channel going. Thank you very much. That is everything for this episode. As always, if you liked it, give it a thumbs up and please subscribe. I'll see you all on the next episode.